Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to day number 2 of my Simon Says Stamp August 2018 card kit series. Today I'm going to be using this background stamp that comes in the kit called Modern Rose Blooms, and I'll also be using one of the images from the Mandy's Flower stamp set as well. I'm starting off here with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 and using one of my images from that stamp set. I'm using my Misty here. This is kind of a larger image, so I want to make sure that I get a good impression. And I am using Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink to go ahead and stamp that out because I will be Copic coloring it. While I have my Misty out, I'm also going to stamp that image on a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper. And I'll go ahead and fussy cut that out. Now, a couple tips when you're cutting out a mask especially, you want to make sure that the paper is smaller. So I'm just cutting around this. I don't want this extra paper hanging off. You want to make sure that you're cutting along the black line as close to it as possible. Keep your scissors straight with your dominant hand. In my case, I'm right-handed, and I'm moving the paper with my left hand. And this allows you to get right up to the edge. Once my mask was cut out, I went ahead and masked my image out on my card panel. And I'm going to be using the background stamp. I'm using a lighter ink here. I'm using Khaki ink by Simon Says Stamp. And when I use a background stamp, especially a rubber stamp, I just lay it flat out on my work surface, ink that up really well, and then I'll lay my card panel face down right directly on the stamp. I use a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that I get a good impression. Next, I'll go ahead and remove my mask and we will start the Copic coloring. I wanted to use all kind of neutral tones and browns and beiges. So I am starting off with these leaves here, and I'm using my E30 markers. I started by laying out my lightest area, which will be where the leaves are kind of laying behind that flower or laying behind each other or the frame. Then I'll move on to my darkest color, then my mid-tone, and then back to my lightest color. Now where that one leaf is laying behind the other one, you want to make sure that there's not two dark areas right directly next to each other, or that shadow will get lost. Just be sure to leave a small highlight on the leaf that is laying on top of the other one, where it is laying on top of the other one, so you can actually see that shadow. Next, I will move on to the flower. And I'm starting off with my lightest color here, and I'm gonna just color in the entire thing. I was gonna lay out my shadow areas, but there's a lot of lines within this stamp that kind of guide you as to where your shadows will be. So I just colored the entire thing in with my E01. Then I'll move on to my darkest color. And for the most part, I'm just laying a line where my shadows will be, but also paying attention to where those little lines are within the image, because I want to extend those out. So I'll start off with my darkest color, and each time I move my way down, I'll extend those out a little bit. A lot of stamps will have these little lines that kind of guide you to give the image a little bit more interest. If they don't, you can add your own if you're comfortable enough doing that. Next, I'll move on to one of my midtones, which is the E15, and I'll just extend those lines out a little bit. Also, where the petals are laying behind another petal, I'll start a little bit of my flicking at this point, and I'll extend those out even further with my next mid-tone color. For my E13, once I bring in that color, I'm going to extend everything out almost to the very edge. even though I colored the entire thing with my lightest color, you just want to leave just a tiny bit of that. That's what gives you your dimension, is your dark colors and your highlight color. But you want very minimal of it. So I'm just leaving the very edges of those petals with the lightest color, and then I'll go back over it just to blend it out a little bit further. Once my flower was colored, I moved on to these little tiny leaves. They're like little stems with really tiny leaves on them. So I'm just using two colors here. Typically when it's a really tiny area like this, I will just start off with my darkest color, then blend that out a little bit with my lightest color. So I'm using my E57 just to put a small little flick in the center of those leaves. And then I'll go in with my E55 and just fill in the rest of that area. Next, for the frame, this circle frame, I'm using my E70 markers and laying out where my darkest areas will be, which will be right under this little cluster of flowers that would create a shadow. And I'm also going to add a darker area off to the side of the circle just to add a little bit of interest, and it will make it look kind of like a little shiny. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, which is E79, which is pretty dark. So I'm using flicks here, kind of like when I color hair. So you want to vary your flicks and barely touch the paper. You want to make sure the marker is barely touching your paper. Next, I'll extend that out with my E74 and then move back into my E70 and fill in the rest of the area. Now for the center of the flower, I debated on what to do with this. I didn't want to leave it flat white. So I'm actually going back in with my E31 markers, which is the markers that I use to color those first leaves. But because I left a highlight on that one leaf that's kind of hanging over, because I left a highlight on the side, it will separate itself. So my E37 will not be directly next to another area where I used my E37. So I'm just laying a small shadow underneath this little flower cluster. This would create a shadow. Then I'll extend it out with my E33. I'm not looking for a whole lot of dimension here. I want it basically to be my E31, which is my lightest color, which I think is the closest color that I have that matches the khaki ink that I used for the background stamp. So I'll fill in the rest of the entire circle with the E31. In order to avoid the little streaks that sometimes you get when you're filling in a larger area, just go over the area twice and you should be able to smooth those out. For my sentiment, I debated on whether or not I wanted to heat emboss this or just use straight ink. Ultimately, I decided to use dark chocolate ink, also by Simon Says Stamp. And I started by stamping the larger stamp, the 4U. And I was initially going to put the smaller stamp on top of it, but it was going to go right over my flower. And being I used all the neutral tones to color my flower, it would have just blended right in. So I did go ahead and stamp that underneath the 4U. Once my sentiment was all stamped out, I went ahead and took a Nuvo sparkle pen, I think they call it, and went over the flower as well as the frame, the circle frame. And I wanted to give the panel a little bit of a border. So I did go ahead and take my paper trimmer and just cut that down. I noticed that my image wasn't completely centered anyway, so I trimmed off some of the right side as well as some of the bottom, and then layered that on a dark chocolate piece of cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Once that was done, I realized it needed something a little bit more. So this isn't really noticeable on camera. But in order to make it look like it has a little bit more dimension and not being a one-layer card, I took my C3 and my C1 marker just to add a little bit of a shadow around my image. So I'm just adding the shadow to the lower left-hand side and underneath some of these leaves off to the left, and then blending that out with my C1 a little bit. This will just give it the illusion that it is popped up on the panel. But that is it for day number 2. Thank you so much for stopping by, and come back tomorrow for day number 3. Have a great day.